Laura Montgomery, Emmy nominee for What We Do in the Shadows. This is such a hilarious show. And as a costume designer, how fun is it to work on something that's rooted in period because they're vampires who are hundreds of years old, but also contemporary because they're living in our times?
I think, I mean, you really hit the nail on the head, Joyce, with that summarization, because that is what makes it so fun. I think all costume designers love to work in period, and I love to do period. But with this show, because it is also contemporary, we have the freedom to not be hemmed into any period. So I like to say it's period, but it's all the periods. The conceit that started with the movie, What We Do in the Shadows, is that much like humans, vampires kind of get stuck in their best period. Which for them is when they were human. So our cast, the backstories have them being human in different eras. So Nandor was human in the 1400s in Persia. Laszlo was a human in Victorian England. So we can kind of, ground them in that period and use those influences. But then because they've been alive for hundreds of years, it still makes sense that they would have picked up pieces along the way and had influences along the way. They've had many, many different lives. So we can throw in bits of contemporary clothing too.
For sure. Well, you also took over in season 3. So, what was your approach in kind of just advancing the characters' personal journeys? Like Guillermo, he's leaning more into the Van Helsing coat and like his background of it all. So, yeah, what was your approach to each of the characters when you took over?
Yeah, I took over from Amanda Neal, who had done the movie in New Zealand and did the first 2 seasons of the show. So the characters were already quite established in, their backstories and who they were. She'd already built up these beautiful closets for them, and a lot of moving them forward came from what was written on the page, actually. Guillermo's storyline about becoming a Van Helsing, becoming the bodyguard, that came in through the scripts. And so then we realized, okay, we can bring a little more toughness to his character. He used to be very, 90s, 90s sweaters, 90s knits with the little round glasses. He still has the glasses, but we can introduce things like, and with him, it's really subtle differences, but it would be rolling up his shirt sleeves. That was a really big deal for him, getting to unbutton the first button of his collar, the introduction of a pair of leather gloves, which is kind of quite a badass look for him.
Mm-hmm. And in contrast to the others, like Colin, very neutral. I know he's been described as a beige. That's his mood board color. But this season, or in season 3, he turned 100. That is his birthday. So, and I know you've said like that really helped you kind of like zero in on like you said, like the peak of like his style, right? So how did that inform you going forward in styling Colin?
It definitely did, because we didn't have much of a backstory for him. We didn't know how old he was. I think I always just assumed that he was contemporary. Like I didn't realize he was that old. And so from that, as you said, we was able to really home in on his era of when he was a young man, which would have been like the 40s, early 50s. And so I took a lot of influences of textures and fabrics and tailoring from those periods. So people like the Duke of Windsor in terms of the beautiful checks and some of that tailoring in his later years. Some of the like Cary Grant, some beautiful cuts of suits. So we built some suits for him, and yeah, subtle nods to it, because he still lives in the modern world. So he shouldn't look like he's plucked directly from the 40s and living in 2022. But that was able to really inform, his tastes and his tailoring. And so it was hugely helpful.
Mm-hmm, sure. Yeah, it's just kind of refined, like very 40s are refined. Well, your submission was the Wellness Center, a hysterical episode because Nandor joins a cult run by Jan, which is like an 80s aerobics class. But it's gotta be, I imagine it was fun for all of you guys because it was like stylistically so different because it was just bright colors instead of like the darkly lit rooms they're usually in. And then you got to design like 80s outfits too. So can you talk about that whole experience?
It was a ton of fun. And I had been waiting because the season prior to that, Stephanie Robinson, one of the executive producers, her episode had been the Jackie Daytona episode, which was that kind of like, a perfect piece of television. But another episode where a character takes a journey and kind of explores a different world. And so for this season, it was this wellness center episode. And so we got to create this 80s cult, which had many iterations. Like it started as a yoga cult. It was kind of, and I think initially it was very location based. They wanted to shoot it outside. They were going to do more of like a camp, like summer camp feeling. But because we shoot in Toronto, from September to December, that was not possible because it's really cold. So they moved it inside, and eventually it kind of morphed into the aerobics cult. And so for that, it was a really, really tight collaboration with all of the departments. We built most of all of the athletic clothing. We built the aerobics clothing. And so we purchased fabric or custom dyed fabric to match what the production designer had done with the colors in the space, because there needed to be something off about it because it is a cult. So walking into it, it can't just feel like, oh, you're in an aerobic studio from the 80s. It's that, but there's also another layer of like, something is creepy about this place that just feels a little bit unsettling. So we had it very matchy, very cohesive with the color palette. They're almost wearing uniforms, but not. Watched a lot of the Jamie Lee Curtis movie Perfect. And then really tried to bring some authenticity to it as well. Like I had a lot of fun with Jan. Cree Summer is amazing. She was one of my idols growing up. And so I was able to pull influences from her of like, her tracksuit is based on a Gucci tracksuit. I'd seen a contemporary one. There's a lot of Cher in there, a lot of Debbie Allen. And then for the other vampires, it was trying to be 80s without being cliche or cheesy about it, and thinking that these are things that they would have kept from the 80s. So not doing like that sorority girls party version of like 80s night, but really authentically what people would have worn in the 80s. These vampires have not evolved since then. They got into it and they've just been wearing the same clothes that they have had since the 80s.
Vintage 80s workout clothes. Yeah. Well, I gotta also ask about the third episode, Gail, the iconic Twilight homage. The kickball game outside. I mean, but some of the costumes there were amazing. Like Nandor's like red velvet coat, I think it's like velvet, and Naja's like peacock dress. Oh, so what went into those designs?
Those designs were quite influenced by the weather, actually, and knowing the considerations of shooting outside at night. Because they're vampires, they had always worn capes previously. And we've done some exterior scenes, but we hadn't really been outside all night long. So for this, my first thought was, I don't want to put cave-in a cape. Because it's just really hard to stay warm in a cape. So the first thought was, with coats, we can put extra layers of, I think in his coat, there was a polar fleece lining actually, which, there's a lot of push and pull about the tailoring. But I just wanted to keep them warm. So for him, that was the first time that he had an outer garment with sleeves. So for the coat, that was a build of a beautiful red velvet that I found that already had a texture embossed into it. And then on top of that, I worked with the art department who made these beautiful motifs inspired by some paintings that we'd found from the period, from like 1400s Persian region. So we made the repeatable motifs and we custom embroidered them onto the coat. So we did one for him, one for his stunt double, of course, because there was a lot of flying in the kickball. And then for Nadia's peacock, there was a line in the script, which I'm not sure if it stayed in the final cut, but one of the werewolves makes some really hilarious joke about like, oh, it's these Pride and Prejudice mother bleepers. So I wanted to go really over the top with Nadia, with the decoration. And that costume is one that kind of carries us through because it has the peacock skirt, which is multiple pieces. It's the underskirt, a velvet overskirt. We hand pleated the silk for the trim. There's a detachable bustle. And then she has a bodice that she can wear with it inside, but because this was going to be an exterior costume, there is a jacket that's worn when it's outside. So it's a wool jacket that's dyed to match the peacock velvet.
Wow.
And so that's her warmer piece, and the bustle goes over that. So it comes from the script, and then
Multi-part costume. Well, it looked amazing, and obviously a great episode, and a great season too. Well, Laura, it's great speaking with you. Thanks so much for your time.